So last Sunday, my Easter theme was about the relationship between the Exodus and Easter Day, and that both stories give our understanding of Easter to be principally about human liberation. And there was this wonderful interpretation of the traditional idea of Jesus frees us from sin and death from Harvey Cox that I talked about. And Cox describes this liberation from sin is that all that holds us imprisoned to the past that we are released from with this resurrection experience. And the fear of death symbolizes the fear of the things that terrorize us about the future. So it's a different kind of twist on a familiar, that the resurrection, being a people of the resurrection, we have the means to be freed and liberated from what's holding us back, as well as what's holding us from becoming, achieving our destiny in the future. And today's readings, the lectionary, for the next couple of weeks, we have these kind of resurrection appearances and these different kind of mystical, the doors are locked and Jesus comes in, and a week later, and maybe these are experiences of a community under persecution for fear of the authorities, a community that is worshiping together the first day of the week. And so I want to give a kind of fill out a little bit more of this idea that the resurrection liberates us. And how does the resurrection liberate us in this day and age? And Jesus comes among us and says, "Peace be with you." And I want to dip into each of the readings today because I think there is a message. The readings are very different. The first reading is this very idealistic, almost utopian view. You know, some of you might think it's creeping communism or socialism, that all of a sudden we just sell everything we own and we put it in Millbrook Bank, and we just draw from it and we take care of everybody's needs and so on. I remember when I was negotiating my contract with Chris Mann, there was a funny exchange where he said, "Well, don't you guys believe in the vow of poverty?" And I said, "Well, actually, there's a whole side to the vow of poverty, Chris, and I'm not sure St. Peter's is ready to do that, but it means that I will be taken care of all my needs for the rest of my life." You know, so the church has in different times, different eras. It's very interesting in the Reformation that because of these religious communities where men and women left their families and became monks and nuns, that they were collecting over many generations, you know, the real estate of some very important families. So in England, most of the land was owned by the religious orders. And so in the Reformation, when Henry VIII kind of nationalized the church, he got the booty and was able to do different, you know, things with that. But we often think that the rule of celibacy is about, you know, that you don't have a partner, you're not married, but celibacy was actually about wealth and money, that the church wanted to keep that. So this theme of pooling resources is an old theme, and in Acts, and I want to give a different slant on it today because in the theme of resurrection and liberation, what this message tells me is that because of the resurrection, the people who knew Jesus and experienced Jesus were liberated from ownership. They were liberated from ownership to stewardship. That instead of owning things, they became stewards of things, to take care of things. And that's liberating. And then in the second reading, Emmeline, you did a great job. I think this is your debut officially as a reader, part of our confirmation class. You know, that's a story, and she used words like hearing and seeing and touching. And so resurrection is not some spiritualized out there, it is a very tangible experience that if our eyes are open and our ears are open and our mouth is open, that we will experience resurrection in the everyday things that we see and do. And that's the witness from this letter of John. And then the third kind of insight about what resurrection means is from the gospel itself. And what I'm going to talk about is, in this experience of Jesus, there's what I call a kind of forgiving intimacy. That resurrection is about a forgiving intimacy. So three points in today's sermon. The idea of moving from ownership to stewardship, of seeing and touching and feeling and connecting with resurrection in real life, and then this idea of what it means to be a forgiving, intimate community and person, if we are resurrected people of God, what that might look like. And I want to frame all this also in the idea of leadership, because I think clearly there is a dynamic process that is going on in the gospel in particular, where these kind of ragtag band of disciples who had just deserted Jesus are becoming something else, that they are being transformed into something else. And they become leaders of a movement which becomes the most important movement in the world. And that is transformation. And we begin to see it in Acts when they start seeing, instead of owning things, that this resurrection experience means that they are now stewards of things. And that it's not about we're coming from a place of scarcity, but we live in abundance. We have a different perspective on our lives, and what we thought we owned, we now share. And especially there's enough for everybody, even the needy. And it's a transformation, and people go, what's happening? So resurrection has a kind of like, see how these people love each other. There's something different. And that's part of the evangelism of why this movement began to spread. People changed in their attitude to possessions. And, part of that leadership was not only taking care of the needs of today, but it's also taking care of the needs of the future. And I want to kind of put it in the context of here at St. Peter's. We have been a congregation since 1801. It's extraordinary. And there is in our belonging here, nobody owns St. Peter's, only Jesus. When clergy and lay people think they own St. Peter's, we get in trouble. God and Jesus own St. Peter's. And so we understand in a little way that we are stewards of this place and these traditions. And we are thankful for the people who have been generous and loving, who sat in these pews, who gave us this building and these grounds. And so as stewards of this beautiful gift, we too take our place and take our share and take on the responsibilities of what it means to be good stewards of St. Peter's and the lives. And one of the things that Jim Tozer, as our treasurer, has done this remarkable job in creating this endowment fund that is about to reach $2 million. And that's both the care of St. Peter's and the cemetery, but it means that we draw down about $55,000 a year into our budget to make sure that we meet our budget. And then we also rely on pledges and commitment from you all to continue that work. But Jim, one of Jim's mantras is, think about when you're not here. Think of when you're in heaven. Leave a gift that you're imagining that you're here still. And so people in the past who have been generous, I'm looking at the plaque of Colonel Young and how generous he was in teaching children and loving this place. And his legacy, his memory is still with us. And so, being a leader, we have to kind of name reality. We have to name reality. We've got to share what it really costs to run this place, and also to prepare for the future, to raise up young leaders, the confirmation class, having a lot of fun with them, sharing the faith with the next generation. Many years ago, St. Peter's spent a lot of discernment and resources to support Cam Hardy. Here was a young person in your midst that you raised up, sent her to seminary, and that she shared in ministry in this place and blessed this place, and now her ministry is national. And that you get to connect with her again next week. She's coming back to preach and be with you. But that's an example of leadership means not only we take care of things today, but we plan for the future. And we should be thinking about how we plan for the lay and ordained ministry, not only here at St. Peter's for the future, but for years to come. One of the discussions at the last vestry meeting was looking at how, given our limited resources, how can we begin to care for people who are aging in our community? And so the vestry has come up with the idea of setting up a pastoral care committee. And we've got a committee for worship and the cemetery and all sorts of different committees. So this is again, the vestry is taking the initiative to plan ahead. How do we leverage lay support, working with clergy to do pastoral care in the future? One of the ministries that I'm familiar with is a ministry called Stephen's Ministry. And it's a very impressive movement. It is a lay movement where people go, they spend a week in intensive training, and they become not necessarily counselors, but they become lay people who will accompany somebody who's going through some kind of a transition. It might be a change of a job. We just saw this, for instance, with the Playfairs. They lost their home. They would be ideal candidates for a Stephen's minister who would check in with them and accompany them through that very difficult transition. And it might be focused on, play dates for their children. But the person in need of the care is in the driver's seat. And it's not about fixing it. It's not about trying to solve the problem. It's somebody who just journeys with you through that change and that loss. And it's a wonderful ministry. And then those Stephen ministers they are supported by the priest. So every month they would meet with the priest and we would talk about pastoral care in the parish. And so we're going to be talking about that. And I know there are people in the congregation already who are doing that in their own ways, but maybe not officially. But it gives us, and the Catholic Church does this, Grace Church also would like to do it. So we see Stephen ministry as one of the ways that we think ahead and prepare for ministry in the future. Okay, so secondly, I want to talk about how the resurrection demands more from our senses as we follow the resurrected Jesus into the world. And how do we see and hear and look and touch? And how do we deal with the light and the darkness? How do we deal with the forgiveness of sins that was mentioned in that second reading? How can our leadership bring that kind of dramatic transformation in the world? And the first thing I want to say is that true leaders do not inflict pain or negativity on the world. True leaders do not inflict pain, but they bear it. Christians have a very simple belief system in God. Jesus said, whenever you give a cup of water to a stranger or help someone in need, I am there. So that our experience of resurrection is that simple. We are given a very simple framework to give love and dignity to our neighbor because they are bearers of the image of God. They are fellow sinners that Christ died for. And we may hold them in a vision of love and goodness that they themselves may not yet see or believe, but they may live into with God's grace. To hear and look and touch and see Christ in all persons, God in all things. This is what being a Christian and being a leader demands from us. There's a book by Max Dupree about leadership, and he applies this not only in the churches, but he applies this in our corporate world. And it's about how do you lead? How do you be a good leader? And he says this: leadership is about liberating people to do what is required of them in the most effective and humane way possible. And he goes on to say, the first responsibility of a leader is to define reality. The last is to say thank you. And in between the two, the leader must become a servant and a debtor. That sums up the progress in an artful leader. So leaders are called to create not only a value system for an institution that brings meaning and joy and a framework for people's lives and struggles, but we must always look to the care of becoming and in the future. And I sort of segue into the gospel because what's amazing about this story, Jesus comes among his disciples saying, "Peace be with you." Remember that they have just betrayed him and deserted him. Right? Jesus doesn't go off in a huff and says, well, I'm only going to visit the people who stayed with me at the cross. I'm just going to go and visit Mary and my mother and John, and to hell with the rest of them. He doesn't. He doesn't go and says, well, I demand an apology. And until you apologize and realize how awful you were, he doesn't do that. He comes and he says, peace be with you. And it's like he forgives them. And he is seeing them in a place broken and ragtag and, awful as they were. He sees them in a different light, that they are going to become something else. And that forgiveness is transformational. And then there's this intimacy in this gospel where he says, look at my wounds. Look at my wounds. And those of us who've had surgery or we've had struggles with our health, it is so personal when you are vulnerable enough to show someone your wounds. Right? Think about that. And that conversation with Thomas, the doubting Thomas, put your hand here. And sometimes, not only with Stephen ministry, but sometimes as a priest, you have this incredible privilege and intimacy with people where people share their deepest sorrows and their deepest wounds. So this resurrection is about this, what I'm talking about, this forgiving intimacy that is transformational, that we are invited to live into the world, and Jesus does that with us. We're not perfect, but yet it's to these people that Jesus returns behind the locked doors, and they're living in fear, and that fear is real. End of the first century, people were persecuted. People didn't understand Christianity. I think about what's happening in our country now. Yesterday we had a meeting here in the hall with Rural and Migrant Ministries, and we started talking about people who are here illegally, maybe who have lived here 20, 30 years, and the knock comes to the door. And people are taken away and deported in front of their children. People living in fear every day. And how do we be Jesus in that situation? Jesus comes intimately among them as if nothing had happened. And he invites them not only to look at his wounds, but to touch them and to experience resurrection and the promise of God's forgiveness. So we might ask ourselves, how do we deal with people who have hurt us and wronged us and betrayed us deeply, and still hold the divine image in them when we could easily go elsewhere? Dare we enter that forgiving, intimate space? And one of the things that challenges us about this forgiveness and the forgiveness of sins bit, if we want to forgive someone, it means that we go through a different door that will change our lives. And many of us would rather just stay in the same old, same old. A friend of mine once said, this person's renting a lot of space inside your head and they're not paying any rent. And so forgiveness is kind of selfish and it's kind of liberating. But we have to go through that scary door, and we're walking over, a different path than those old trampled flower beds where it's easier to hold on to grudges. Peace be with you. So lots to think about in our readings today. Resurrection is about liberation. We are liberated from ownership to stewardship. We are invited to look for the resurrected Jesus in the world, in the real world, to have our ears open and our eyes open and to proclaim that resurrection. And also to live in a place of that forgiving intimacy that is transformative. And if we do that well, the people of God, the people will see that and will want to be a part of it. The resurrected community. Amen.